Welcome to the National Fantasy Pregame Show, brought to you by Nolan Ryan Beef Jerky, the official beef jerky of the Major League Clubhouse Managers, available at Kroger's and Amazon.com, and also brought to you by Fantistics and InsideOfFootball.com. Head on over and dominate your season-long fantasy play, and MyFantasyFix.com. That's MyFantasyFix.com, where you'll find Michael Waldo and myself and Chris Cheon and Phil Backett and Skeeter Robinson. Getting you set up for Week 6 DFS, Michael. You know Michael Waldo from SiriusXM Fantasy Sports Radio. Maybe you know me as well from SiriusXM Fantasy Sports Radio. I'm Lou Blassie. Michael, how are we doing this week?
Good, doing well, Lou. It's good to have you back.
We're a third of the way through the season. Hard to believe.
Unbelievable, really. I mean, you think about how quickly the football season comes. You know, when we're talking in the baseball season, we always say, oh, man, it seems too early to go. But then once you get into football season, it seems like it just flies right by.
Yeah, and we've got some posts up on Fantistics and InsideOfFootball.com, MyFantasyFix.com, us at Fantistics and MyFantasyFix.com. We finally got some numbers to work with. I think it's a representative sample. I mean, football is never a great sample for us, right?
Yeah, well, right. Yeah, I mean, you talk about it when you go from baseball where you have a sample size of 600 at bats to 17 games. It's a huge difference in sample, and you got to draw some conclusions. You got to look at more of the external factors around there. Look at coaching schemes a little bit more. Try to figure out what the coaches are trying to do, rather than necessarily the results on the field. You got to draw more conclusions that way than you would necessarily in baseball. But I think now we're at a point where we can get a pretty good understanding of who these players are, what these teams are trying to do, and now you can start to kind of implement more strategies on this year data.
This is the Running Back Podcast on the National Fantasy Pregame Show Facebook page. You'll find a quarterback podcast and a wide receiver and tight end podcast as well. Bros in Football Week 6 with Phil Backett and Chris Cheon, and in a couple weeks you're going to be on with them, Michael. This should be fun.
Yeah, I'll be in D.C. with the boys, so I'll get to bro it out that weekend and see what it's all about doing a show from a rooftop bar. So
maybe I'll fly down and join you. We'll do it all together.
Yeah, we should.
That would be awesome. Not too far from me. Running backs cash games this week in Week 6.
Yeah, so looking at Week 6, we're really at a point where lots of running backs are banged up. Lots of running backs are on bye. And we're at a situation where pricing across the industry, for the most part, has kind of stabilized. So we don't have a ton of really strong values anywhere. There's no value that pops down as a must play. And honestly, I like it better this week. I like it better when we don't have a clear-cut value play, because I think it helps spread ownership out, and I think it helps kind of give an edge to the players that really know kind of what's going on. But to me, there's three backs that really lead the way this week. Two based on, just total skill level and what we expect, and one based on price. And I think if you talk about those guys, obviously Le'Veon Bell, phenomenal play.
Every week we talk about Le'Veon Bell.
Every week we talk about it. But I especially like Le'Veon Bell on weeks where the Steelers go on the road, because we know how Big Ben struggles on the road. So I think typically we see that offense lean a little bit more heavily on Le'Veon Bell's legs in those weeks. And that's a week this week where they go to Kansas City, and Kansas City's defense is pretty banged up at this point. And even, against the rush, they're not the same, lockdown defense that we saw last year. They're actually giving up a ton of points. So I think Le'Veon Bell is a guy who he's a really high priced option, but he's again leads the way in cash games. I think if you can afford him, you definitely should. The other guy last week, we touted him as a tournament play. And he came through for us in a big way. Leonard Fournette this week enters into the cash game option, going up against a Rams defense that, while they have an excellent pass rush, they get burned frequently on the run. And the Jacksonville Jaguars are doing everything in their power to hide Blake Bortles, and they're going to continue to lean heavily on Fournette. So I think Fournette and Bell, if you're talking top tier, top clear-cut options in cash games, you're going to want to get exposure to one of these two guys. And the third back I mentioned as kind of an obvious play this week, I think Jordan Howard, even though it's a road game for Chicago, his price is really, really attractive across the industry. Just $6,900 on FanDuel, $5,900 on DraftKings. And we know that the Bears are going to continue to lean on the run. They're not going to want to expose Mitch Trubisky too much. Obviously, it wasn't a great debut for him. So I think Jordan Howard is in a really interesting spot this week as well.
And he's going to continue to get his market share
on
the touches?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't agree with the way they have utilized that backfield between, Tarek Cohen and Howard. I think there's definitely a spot where they can both be on the field together. But as we have seen from the Bears over the last several weeks, Howard didn't see any attempts on the backfield last week, but he still saw 19 touches, 19 rushing attempts. Week before that, he saw 22 total combined rushes and targets, and the week before that, he saw 28. So I'm not at all concerned about workload for him. I think he's going to continue to see the work, and as we've seen from Baltimore, they also struggle against the running backs as well. So I think he's in a great spot. If there's one cash game quote unquote value play that I'm locking in cash games, it probably is Jordan Howard.
All right, so if you don't have the value plays that you're looking for, how do you do the pairings on cash games? You go with one of the chalk three that you just laid out, and then try to get some, who do you figure for the second side of the? Do you try to save some money, or do you just try to go solid?
Yeah, no, I think it depends what you do with the rest of your lineup. I probably leave that second running back position open, and I probably go and fill the rest of my lineup out and come back and just kind of see where I'm sitting, and then I can tweak from there. I think for the most part, just from the early builds that I've been doing, it's going to be hard to pay up for, obviously two of those three backs I talked about. I think you're going to need to seek value elsewhere.
Find a red zone specialist, something like that.
Yeah,
a finisher.
Honestly, I think Mike Gillislee is not a bad idea this week against the Jets.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. So I think Gillislee is definitely in an interesting spot this week. We talk about the struggles that Brady has had in the past against the Jets. So I think Gillislee's a really interesting option. It's just risky for cash games, Lou. That's the problem with it. But on the other side of that ball, too, I think Bilal Powell could also see some attention as well against the Patriots. So both of those running backs in that game are, kind of those mid-tier values, and you can kind of slot them in. I think if you're going to go that route, you're going to want to mix and match your cash game lineups. You're not going to want to stick to one just cash game and trust one of those guys. You want to get exposure to probably a few different of those cheap end options. It would really help if you don't play the main slate, because it opens up the door a little bit more. You can go, you can get access to Christian McCaffrey, who, really he rates pretty favorably in just the way he's utilized. We know that the Eagles are tough against the run, but they struggle to really defend the running backs that work out of the backfield as a receiver, and that's primarily what Christian McCaffrey has done this year. So I think he's a pretty interesting option there as well. So it really just kind of depends what you're going for. Jerick McKinnon, he's a guy on the main slate that could see a larger workload this week. He's going up against a Green Bay team that is not very good. He's just $4,100 on DraftKings, so he's a really cheap end option that could see a lot of work. If you're playing the Thursday to Monday slate, I think Marlon Mack on DraftKings is a worthy flex play. He's just $3,900. So there's a lot of interesting options if you expand your net a little bit more. DeMarco Murray, another guy on that Monday night game, just $5,200 on DraftKings, $6,300 on FanDuel. So that's kind of what I was getting at, is if you're playing that Thursday and Monday slate, this is a nice week because there's a lot of value plays in both games, Thursday and Monday, that you can get exposure to that you're not going to be able to get on the main slate.
I'm interested if Powell comes up on your tournament options as well, because what I see with Powell and the Patriots defense is the Patriots defense is giving a lot of big plays up.
Yeah.
And one day could turn him into one particular gain, or one big gash, or one 40-yard run could turn him into a really good value.
Yeah, I think you need to keep that in mind too when you're talking, cash games versus tournament plays with running backs. Just because a guy's a cash game play doesn't mean you can't play him in tournaments. It doesn't mean he's not a good tournament play. It's tougher to use that same logic if you're talking about a guy who's primarily a tournament option. Sometimes he's not always a cash game option, but anytime we talk about cash game plays, you definitely can use them in tournaments as well.
All right, what are we looking at in GPP in the running back position this week?
The guy that I really like, and I think people are kind of down on him for a multitude of different reasons, but I think Lamar Miller this week is going to be in for a good week against Cleveland. A lot of people are focusing on that passing attack, and rightfully so. Deshaun Watson has really turned it around. Will Fuller came back and has looked good. Obviously, DeAndre Hopkins has looked good. But I think they're going to turn to the running game, and I think Lamar Miller could be in line for a nice day this week. So I'm looking there. Devontae Freeman, always in the conversation for me just because he is such a talented back, and people always shy away from rostering him because they're afraid of Tevin Coleman. They're afraid of him eating into his ownership. It's hard to predict what week each one will go off. So his ownership level is always artificially low based upon, his skill set. So I think he's in a really good spot this week. And, I think a guy who's probably going to go a little bit overlooked this week just because we're going to be looking down at some of those cheaper options, or we're going to be paying up just a little bit more. I think Todd Gurley this week burned a lot of people last week, didn't come through like he should have. But against Jacksonville's defense, as we saw, if there's a way to exploit it, it's on the ground. It's definitely not through the air. So I think the Rams match up nicely this week against Jacksonville, and I think Gurley is going to have a really, really big day.
Interesting, going back to Lamar Miller in Cleveland. Cleveland is giving up the least NFL targets per game to wide receivers in the NFL. So other offenses are going other ways. Yeah, well, they don't have to. Playing a controlled game, right?
That's right. Yeah, so it'll be an interesting game. I think this game's going to play closer than what you might think. So I think that it actually might be a little bit more passing, but I think Lamar Miller is a guy that nobody's going to be thinking about at all.
All right, that's our running back podcast for Week 6. Head on over to the National Fantasy Pregame Show Facebook page. Find our quarterback podcast and our wide receiver and tight end podcast as well. Phil and Chi with Bros and Football Week 6 will be up as well before the main slate on Sunday. The National Fantasy Pregame Show is brought to you by Nolan Ryan Beef Jerky, the official beef jerky of Major League Clubhouse Managers. Fantistics and InsideOfFootball.com also brings you the National Fantasy Football Game, National Fantasy Pregame Show. That's what this show is called, by the way. And MyFantasyFix.com. Head on over to the redesigned site. Take a look at that there. I'm going to give you a look at the page here. I'll give you a little preview. Go over, and you can find a lot of great free content over there as well. Get you set up for the main slate, and if you want to check out a single week premium subscription to My Fantasy Fix and try it out this week, I suggest you do that as well. National Fantasy Pregame Show. Give us a like on Facebook so you know when we're posting stuff, so you can keep up with it. And we'll see you all next time.